In this talk, I link the field of environmental justice studies to the emerging field of climate justice studies by examining some links between and among universities, prisons, and environmental and climate justice struggles. Climate justice and environmental justice are tightly interwoven discourses, practices, and visions of social change. And I argue that we can illuminate some of those linkages in practice by connecting the institutions of academia and the prison system to climate and environmental justice politics, particularly in relation to divestment campaigns, because these institutions are, at times, instruments of social oppression and ecological harm. Specifically, I demonstrate that prisons and universities actively contribute to environmental injustice and climate change through planning decisions and investments that support fossil fuel economies and place ecosystems and human health at great risk. Environmental justice, scholarship, and politics have, for decades, emphasized the fact that many communities marginalized by economic, political, and social systems also faced greater anthropogenic environmental threats. Climate justice scholarship and politics have documented the same, with a specific focus on climate-related hazards. The philosophies and politics of environmental and climate justice, then, offer visions of a future where social justice, democracy, and ecological sustainability prevail. David Schlossberg and Lisette Collins demonstrate the myriad linkages and fusions between the movements and scholarship for environmental and climate justice. For example, they note that concerns about climate change have long been present within EJ movements, with a particular emphasis on the goal of reducing fossil fuel extraction and carbon emissions and ensuring a just transition for workers and communities negatively impacted by a shift away from fossil fuel production. They also note that environmental justice movements have demanded accountability from fossil fuel industries for those fence-line communities that are most heavily affected by petrochemical production. More recently, Schlossberg and Collins point out, environmental justice movements have confronted the social forces that contribute to the vulnerabilities of communities hit by extreme weather events like Hurricane Katrina, which devastated much of the U.S. Gulf region in 2005. And while environmental justice movements and research have a longer formal history than climate justice movements and research, the two have blended and integrated in many ways. As such, neither academics nor policymakers can comprehend the meaning of climate justice without understanding the long and pluralistic history of the social movements that have developed the concept over the past decades, and specifically that the ideas, demands, and principles seen in the environmental justice movement have had a direct influence on the conceptualization of climate justice. So both movements are deeply connected from the beginning, and both are multi-scalar in their reach, from the local to the transnational scales, and they demand attention and challenges to the existing relationships between human communities and the environments that sustain them. Furthermore, both movements have at times emphasized the need to challenge global capitalist systems and the concomitant risks that are imposed on marginalized communities, as well as emphasizing a desire to create mechanisms for ensuring procedural justice and compensation for those harms. So in the next section of the talk, I want to offer a sketch of two social movements that speak to key environmental, climate, and social justice concerns. Fossil-Free UC is a campaign led by students, faculty, staff, and alum from the 10-campus University of California system, and that works to raise awareness of the hazards of the fossil fuel economy and to urge the University of California to divest from fossil fuels and allocate its investments with greater attention to climate risk and social responsibility. The Fossil-Free UC campaign has had major successes since its inception in 2012. In September of 2015, for example, the UC system agreed to sell off its endowment and pension fund holdings in oil sands and coal companies, a decision worth $200 million. However, divesting from tar and oil sands and coal still left traditional non-tar sands oil and natural gas investments untouched. So, building on that victory, many fossil-free UC student activists have taken up the call to, in their words, divest the rest. So toward that end, in the spring of 2017, students at several UC campuses took part in sit-ins to raise the stakes and visibility of their demand for total divestment from fossil fuels. 4 University of California chancellors endorsed their cause, and students are continuing to work toward securing an agreement from the UC regents to achieve the goal of total divestment. In December of 2015, just 3 months after the fossil-free UC achieved its first divestment success, the African Black Coalition, also a University of California statewide student group, succeeded at pushing the UC system to divest some $25 million from private prisons. The Africa Black Coalition is a UC-wide campaign led by black students concerned with drawing attention to and confronting the ways in which that university's systems, policies, affect black students and people throughout the African diaspora. This divestment from private prisons was prompted by concerns about the UC system's relationship to private prisons and to those who finance that industry, because of the disproportionate number of people of African descent who are incarcerated in such facilities. The African Black Coalition pushed even further, building on its initial success by announcing an additional demand that the UC must divest $425 million from Wells Fargo Bank. This is a photo of members of the ABC, the African Black Coalition. They announced this demand of a divestment from Wells Fargo Bank for several reasons. One, because of the bank's discriminatory lending practices in black and brown neighborhoods. Two, because of the bank's role as a syndication agent and issuing lender for Core Civic Corporation, which was formerly Corrections Corporation of America, a private prison company. Three, because of the bank's status as a trustee to the GEO Group, the largest private prison company in the U.S. And 4, because of the bank's membership in the so-called Million Shares Club, a group of investors with at least 1 million shares in Core Civic and the GEO Group, all of which meant, effectively, that the University of California and Wells Fargo Bank were financing the dehumanization of black and migrant people. Now, in both the fossil-free UC and African Black Coalition campaigns, we see a number of similarities, a number of parallels. However, it appears that there is no clear effort on the part of these two groups to work together and to link the divestment from fossil fuels to the divestment from prisons. In other words, the UC system is invested in both fossil fuel and prison industries, both of which perpetrate environmental and climate injustices. So why not link these campaigns? I contend that activists and scholars can and should acknowledge the links between universities and prisons around the goals of racial, environmental, and climate justice, because universities, prisons, banks, and the fossil fuel industry are instruments of social oppression and ecological harm. So I want to explore these linkages in the next section of my talk. Environmental injustice and climate injustice are terms that scholars and activists use to describe the fact that environmental threats in general and climate disruptions in particular affect communities, nations, and regions of the globe differently and unevenly, with Global South communities, people of color communities, and indigenous communities being hit the hardest. These injustices and outcomes are compounded by the fact that these same communities have contributed the least to creating the problem of global ecological risks and climate change. It is these challenges that the environmental justice and climate justice scholarship and politics seek to address. So Fossil Free UC and the African Black Coalition have documented the fact that universities contribute to both environmental and climate injustices and the social injustices associated with the prison industrial complex. But how, if at all, are these practices linked? The answer is simple. They are connected because prisons are sources and sites of environmental and climate injustice. So it is now clear that there are numerous ways that prisons and environmental threats intersect to produce harm to bodies of prisoners and corrections officers and to nearby ecosystems and communities. The following is just a sampling. First, there are confirmed reports of water contaminated with arsenic, lead, and many other pollutants at prisons and jails in nearly 20 U.S. states, including the now infamous case of Flint, Michigan, where the Genesee County jail's inmates, including pregnant women, were forced to drink toxic water while prison guards drank filtered bottled water. This image, "Water is a Human Right," is projected by the activist group the Detroit Light Brigade during a protest in January of 2016 in downtown Flint, Michigan, at the Genesee County Jail. The Rikers Island Jail in New York City was built atop a landfill that for years has produced methane gas explosions and is plagued with health complaints from cancer-stricken corrections officers. The Victorville Federal Correctional Complex in California was built on a former nuclear weapons storage area. It is now a federally designated toxic military Superfund site, which means it is recognized by the federal government as contaminated land that poses a threat to human and/or environmental health. The Northwest Detention Center in the Seattle-Tacoma area is a privately operated prison designed to house more than 1,500 immigrant detainees and is built adjacent to a federally designated toxic Superfund site. Again, which means it is contaminated land that poses a threat to human and/or environmental health. Prisoners across many states in the U.S. recycle hazardous electronic waste for very low wages and enjoy few, if any, health and safety protections afforded to workers who are working in industries outside of the prisons. Texas prisoners faced some of the worst heat and humidity of any inmates in the U.S. because of extreme weather combined with the lack of air conditioning and deficient medical care at facilities throughout the state. A recent investigation by the University of Texas at Austin concluded that 14 prisoners died between the years 2007 and 2014 due to extreme heat and neglect by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Now, the impacts of prisons outside their walls are also profound. Sewage overflows, chemical toxins, fossil fuel emissions, air pollution, and hazardous waste generated from inside many jails and prisons affect ecosystems and humans and non-human species and communities on the outside, as they also impact waterways, ambient air, and nearby land bases. For example, between 2006 and 2014, the Monroe Correctional Facility, which is just north of the city of Seattle, dumped 500,000 gallons of sewage into the Skykomish River, which is a popular recreational and fishing spot for people in the region. In another case, the proposed prison in Letcher County, Kentucky, is to be built on a mountaintop removal coal mining site near a low-income community, and it also threatens at least 71 non-human species, many of them endangered, including the Indiana bat and the gray bat. And this is slated to cost taxpayers somewhere upwards of $444 million. So the fact that these non-human species and ecosystems are more vulnerable via the prison system speaks to the ways that human and non-human communities are linked through what David Nybert calls entanglements of oppression. Communities entangled within and across species reveal how the scholarship on environmental inequality and intersectionality can benefit from extending beyond the restrictive boundaries of the human to encompass and observe the modes through which humans and non-humans are connected, through discourses, policies, and practices of oppression and privilege making. And while universities are sites where investment decisions contribute to climate change, racism, and the prison industrial complex, academia is also complicit in another way, in that many scholars are actually developing research and promote ideas that support the strengthening of the oppressive criminal legal system and that promote the denial of environmental racism and anthropogenic climate change. For example, Roy Spencer is a research scientist at the University of Alabama, Huntsville, who has received funding from the coal company Peabody Energy to publicly testify against the science documenting human-driven climate change. In another example, Dr. Edward Schein is infamous among activists in the anti-prison community for having developed theories of brainwashing and behavior modification that, in the view of many scholars, amount to deprivation and torture. Dr. Schein's work has led to the widespread adoption of some of his techniques in prisons throughout the U.S. Thus, because prisons and academia are spaces where environmental and climate and racial injustices are evident, amplified, and ongoing, I suggest that the Fossil-Free UC and African Black Coalition might see fit to connect their campaigns and visions for social change. So articulating productive linkages between environmental justice and climate justice scholarship and politics that are focused on the unequal burdens of anthropogenic socio-ecological violence is necessary because these are tightly interwoven discourses, practices, and visions of social change. These linkages can be realized in a material fashion by connecting struggles for fossil fuel divestment with struggles for divestment from the prison industrial complex. There is now ample evidence that both universities and prisons are sites where the struggle against environmental and climate injustices must be waged. I've taken the liberty of offering unsolicited advice to the Fossil-Free UC campaign and the African Black Coalition to consider building on the important victories and work that they've done already by building enduring connections between their efforts to create change inside and outside of academia and the prison industrial complex. This is a challenge to both movements to notice and to act on the historical and contemporary connections among the fossil fuel and prison industries and the socially and environmentally oppressive practices that constitute the core of their foundations and the core logic of global capitalism itself. In other words, drawing these connections is not an exercise in abstract theory. It is, I believe, a cultural and material necessity for our survival. Thank you, and I look forward to your comments and feedback.